Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to my YouTube channel called Treasures Galore. My name is Michael Elder, and this is my third and final installment of my series titled Where Warm Waters Halt. Now I hope you guys are staying safe and sanitized and avoiding large groups of people. If you do find yourself quarantined, what better way to spend your time than to watch my videos? I was going through the analytics of my channel and I noticed that the majority of people watching my videos are not subscribers. So if you're not a subscriber, it would mean a lot to me to click that subscribe button and click the notifications bell so you can get notifications of when I make videos. So I am going to start going live. I don't know what time of the day, mostly in the evening or, what day of the week that I'm going to do it, kind of whenever I have time, but I'm going to start doing live videos on my channel by myself. So if you do like this channel, make sure you subscribe so you can, get a notification that I am going live. Me and Carter, like I always say, are also teaming up and going live on his channel, so make sure you subscribe to the House Husband Diaries. We got our audio issue fixed, and we are excited to do our live video finally of this same topic, where warm waters halt, because this is the most important thing we could talk about, according to Forrest Fenn. He always says that, people spend too much time on the blaze and stuff, and all of that does not matter if you do not have the starting point. So there's little talk about it. So, here I am just putting my thoughts out about where I think where warm waters halt. Now, in my first video, I brought up the potholes on Canyon Street, and this video is going to tie back into the potholes on Canyon Street. And then I went over the scalding water and the kettles and the smelling, the smell was bad. And I went over the multiple instances of that through the books. My second video, I went through the train station where he would go take a warm shower, and that was also on Canyon Street. And so I brought up the many instances of, showers, running water, and the train station. So in this video, it's titled, paved roads. And so there's not, there are some mentions of this. There's not too many, not as much as I brought up in my last two videos, but there are some that I think is really interesting. So this video may be kind of short, but I think it'll be worth your while because it ties you back right to, a specific spot for where warm waters halt. And you got to use your imagination a little bit. Imagination is more important than knowledge, and I firmly believe that. So let's get started. On page 4 of The Thrill of the Chase, he says, "Varied are the many roads I've traveled to reach my 80 years, and not all have been paved with smiles and accolades." So metaphorically speaking, he's saying, I've went down these many roads in my life, and, not all of them have been paved. Some of them had been really bumpy, and some of them have been paved. So the first instance of a paved road. Now, that may not seem like much, but again, that ties me back to the Totem Cafe caper when he talks about Canyon Street, and it wasn't paved, so there was deep potholes on Canyon Street. So let me just read that real quick. "That was many years before the streets were paved, so the deep potholes on Canyon Street often were filled with water that was fair game for every car that bounced by." So in the preface he says, varied are the many roads I've traveled, and not all have been paved, which kind of made me think about Canyon Street. So the next thing I'm going to bring up really quick, it is probably a rabbit hole, and I am going to bring outside information. I just saw this article, and I read it a few years back, and I thought it was interesting, so I'm just going to tie it in there. I think there's one important thing that people might get out of it, and so I'm going to bring it up. So on page 6, he says, "Then all of a sudden I started getting bald. Just a little at first, so it wasn't a big deal. I remember the same thing happened to President Eisenhower. Okay, so he says, I started getting bald. To me, that seems weird because wouldn't you say I started going bald instead of getting bald? And then he said, I remember the same thing happened to President Eisenhower. So let me bring up two other things in The Thrill of the Chase, and then I'm going to bring up an outside article that, you can take it or leave it. I'm not saying it's important, I just think it's kind of interesting and I want to bring it up. So on page 45 of The Thrill of the Chase, it's the chapter In Love with Yellowstone. So he says, you may not be old enough to know that a war was going on and that everything was rationed. Tires, gas, and lots of other stuff. So we drove about 35 miles an hour for 1,600 miles with no air conditioning or radio. Even so, my father always drove about 50 miles out of our way down a little dirt road to a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming. So, some interesting things in this. The war was on, and tires and gas and lots of other stuff were rationed. So it mentioned the war and tires. And then he says, we drove about 50 miles out of our way down a little dirt road to a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming. So they drove 50 miles down a dirt road, not paved, to a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming. So let's go to the next chapter, page 55. And this is the chapter, The Long Ride Home. And so the postmark in this is titled Somewhere in Wyoming. And then in the chapter Goldenmore, it says somewhere, north of Santa Fe, I believe, or something like that. So, similarities in the postmarks. There's also another postmark that says somewhere in Montana, which I think is interesting also. Because there's no postmark that says north or somewhere in Colorado. So let me read. So off we went at 20 miles an hour and with almost no money. We had a flat about every 50 miles. So the car was packed with spare tires that we had salvaged from city dumps along the way. The war was on and tires were hard to come by. So again, another mention of 50 miles and tires. And there was a war going on and everything was rationed. So, kind of brings me back to the other chapter when he mentions the same exact things. And this chapter is conveniently called The Long Ride Home. Now, I believe that the key word is home, and he's using it synonymously with the home of Brown, the long ride home. I think there's a long ride to Home of Brown, and that's 50 miles. Now, throughout all the books, I'm going to probably make a video about this, but he always talks about, either it took an hour. He always mentions an hour. So 50 miles traveling down this road probably take you close to an hour to drive it. So, like I said, the war was going on, the roads weren't paved, and they were, the tires were rationed. So, and 50 miles. So the next page, 57, he says, no cars passed by and it was getting cold. So I started walking on the paved road in my socks. So another mention of paved roads. So this is the rabbit hole that I'm going to bring up, and it is this article titled Eisenhower's 1919 Road Trip and the Interstate Highway System. Now on page 6, he said, I started getting bald, which I think he should have said going bald. And he also brings up President Eisenhower. So I did a Google search of Eisenhower and looked up some interesting stuff, and I found this article. So I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to do this really quick because, again, I think it's a rabbit hole, and you can do, if you think this is interesting, you can, look it up on your own time. So in this trip, he's talking about President Eisenhower's trip, and it's through Wyoming. Now, they sent the army in a huge convoy that was like 2 or 3 miles long, and they were assessing how the road conditions were. And they weren't paved, and they were very rough, and they broke down quite a bit. had problems with, their tires and getting stuck in sand and all these other stuff, that comes along with the roads not being paved and in poor condition. So, again, Eisenhower talking about the road conditions not being paved, and there's some interesting stuff in this. So, the roads were in horrible shape and they faced breakdowns all the time. And it also talks about rationed food and how the war was going on and everything was rationed, which I think is interesting. Now, I know this is in the 1919 road trip, so this is talking about World War I instead of World War II. So, he says, later on in this, he says, the effects of the altitude exceeding 6,000 feet made it difficult for the car's engines. And that brought me back to The Thrill of the Chase also, talking about Skippy landing his plane on Hebgen Lake, and it was 6,000 feet above sea level, so the plane couldn't take off again. So, mentioning about the high altitude in Wyoming. And then another interesting thing is that most of the roads that they traveled down weren't actually roads. They were Union Pacific Railroad Station right-of-ways. And so I thought that, again, was interesting because, the Union Pacific Railroad Station in West Yellowstone is right there on Canyon Street that Forrest Fenn brings up. So, two more things. It talks about this guy named Parrish, and on this trip he made the first topographical map in the United States, the first one in the United States, which I thought was interesting because Forrest Fenn says, and or a good map. So the last thing I want to bring up, and this is really interesting, is that he's talking about I-80, the major highway that's in Wyoming, and when they built it, the local people in Wyoming warned them about this area that they're building the road because the weather's so horrible there. And so within 4 days of that being built, they nicknamed it the Snow Chi Ming Trail, which is, it's going off of the trail that Forrest Fenn bombed in Vietnam. And they just switched the first word out for snow, which I thought was really interesting. So that's it for that. I'm going to jump back to the books where I think is really important. So, let me go back and find my place. So I brought up varied are the many roads I've traveled. Started getting bald. Same thing happened to President Eisenhower. He mentions the war was on 2 times. Mentions dirt roads and paved roads. And then, on page 63 of The Thrill of the Chase, it is in the chapter Looking for Lewis and Clark. So, Forrest Fenn writes, I won't dwell further on that because I'm grateful that the space between fact and fiction is often blurred by the passage of time, except to say that we finally loosened our grip on the reins and the horses took us to a dirt road. We were 50 miles from where we started, and Donnie was in good spirits again and started talking coherently. So, another mention of a dirt road and the distance, 50 miles. So let's continue. On page 65, the next page, it is in Buffalo Cowboys. So it says, after a quick vote, they decided that I would be the one to catch the buffalo. So after tying one end of the rope securely to the front axle of the car, I started my stalk. Big buffalo bulls have no enemies, so it was easy to slip up behind a tree and throw a loop which landed on Coney's head and wrapped around the horns. I slowly inched the rope tight, then retreated about 50 feet to the car. So another mention of 50 as in a distance. But before that, he writes, Skippy had an old car with no top. It had one big seat in the front, and that's it. One day, when a buffalo wandered out of Yellowstone Park and started tearing up fences, Donnie Joe thought we should go out and round it up. So after loading Skippy's heavy boat anchor rope in the car, the three of us went looking for the buffalo. We found it about 7 miles west of town in a large sagebrush flat that had a whole bunch of pine trees everywhere. He was a big bull, and we started calling him Cody. So he's talking about them, roping this buffalo, and he would throw it, and it was 50 feet, which is really interesting. Another mention of 50 feet. And also, later in this chapter, he talks about them, they roped this buffalo, excuse me, I'm losing my place right here. And it says, okay, it took us a few seconds to recover and realize that the front axle and both front wheels had gone with Cody. So just made me think about all the other instances of the bad roads and the tires and the wheels, and then there's another instance of 50 feet. So on page 109, on Teachers with Ropes, one afternoon I walked in the Kachina Gallery on Canyon Road. So another mention of a road or a street that's named Canyon. So that's it for the thrill of the chase. Now let's bring up Too Far to Walk. And so let's go to the chapter that I brought up in my last video, and that is River Bathing is Best. So I brought this up and talked about the train station and him taking a warm shower there. But there's a few things that I thought was interesting in this one. So, again, he mentions the number 50 again. And I'm kind of going off on the number 50 and why I think that is, too far to walk. So, in this chapter, right after he talks about taking the shower, he says, occasionally I'd ride my bike into Yellowstone Park to a spot about 20 miles from town where a seldom used dirt road turned right off the main drag. So he's talking about a seldom used dirt road that turned right off the main drag. So that brought me back to the Totem Cafe caper when he said it wasn't much of a main drag, just about 5 blocks. Talking about, where the Totem Cafe caper is, right there on the main drag. So he brings up the same thing where a seldom used dirt road turned right off the main drag. So both instances talking about the main drag and a dirt road, or a road that had potholes in it before it was paved. So go to the next page, and page 22. Let me read. Several years ago, with my daughter Kelly's family, my wife and I drove to the little road. It's paved now, and walked to the river. I try to get my granddaughters to swim where it's been so many peaceful hours. So, right before that, he's talking about a seldom used dirt road that turned right off the main drag. And then right now, he's telling you that this road is paved now. And it's in parentheses, and he kind of just throws it in there. Now, I know he's writing a story and explaining where he was, but I think it's interesting that he just throws that, oh, it's paved now, that road. To me, that brings me back to the Totem Cafe caper and where I believe where Mar's Halt is, and Canyon Street. So, let me continue. So on page 26, he's talking about 17 miles down a little dirt road. So again, another mention of dirt roads. Page 33, he talks about the narrow sandy road. Again, not paved. Page 35 talks about a sandy road again. So that's it for the books. And I wanted to bring up a few quotes about, dirt roads. So he was asked if you need four-wheel drive to hunt for the treasure. And he's talking about, in the Rocky Mountains, you need a vehicle that can get you out of tough spots. So he says, once a friend and I were in some lonely mountains during a violent windstorm. Trees fell across the narrow dirt road. Interesting. And then, this is the last one I want to bring up, is he's talking about the San Lazaro Pueblo, and it takes about 40 minutes to get there, 6 miles down a little dirt road. And then this one, he says, we came to a little dirt road to the left that was there with the grass, and there was grass growing over it. And this is talking about him cutting down trees, I believe, and being by Denny Creek. So again, a little dirt road. And that's all the quotes that I want to bring up. And then my last thing is this. So listen to this first part of this video talking about rules.
I started making rules when I was about 8 years old. Too young to have the intelligence to make rules for myself. But I remember I was sitting on my front porch in Temple, Texas, about 8 or 9 years old, out on the edge of town. The street in front of us, I don't remember, it may have not even been paved. I think it was paved because the cemetery was right there in that paved road. But anyway, there was a...
Isn't that interesting? So he's talking about rules. He's talking about this cowboy coming up to him and punching him right in the nose, which seems like a made-up story to me. About 8 years old, and this dude just rides up to this, to this little kid and just pops him right in the nose. Seems made up. But he's talking about paved roads. So right before he talks about this, he pauses and then kind of looks up, really thinking about what he's going to say. And he said, I don't even remember if the street was paved. No, it was paved because the cemetery is right there on that paved road. So, confirmation bias, I know. I believe cemeteries are really important. I believe that no place for the meek is a cemetery or a graveyard. And if you haven't watched my video about that, you should. So, really random thing to bring up. Just, I don't know if the streets were paved. Oh, it was paved because the cemetery was right there on that main road. So, just a really random thing to say in this video. And for him to look up and really think about what he's saying makes me think that maybe this is important. Bringing you back to paved road and, Canyon Street. Let's listen to it again really quick.
Front porch in Temple, Texas, about 8 or 9 years old, out on the edge of town. The street in front of us, I don't remember, it may have not even been paved. I think it was paved because the cemetery was right there in that paved road. But anyway, there was a livery stable about...
So, just an interesting thing that I caught while watching those interviews with Forrest Fenn, just bringing up paved roads randomly, and that there was a cemetery right there on that paved road. Now, I know he lived in Temple, Texas, and he lived by a cemetery. I get it. But he's using these stories as a catalyst to be able to explain, hints to the clues that are in his poem. So that's it for this video, guys. You might think that this is nothing, and I'm just using kind of confirmation bias to find stuff to point me back to this one place. But, in these instances, he's talking about, bringing up dirt roads and paved roads and, a whole bunch of tires and stuff. And then, just the way he brings them up is just kind of really random. And especially since he ties back to the main drag and river baiting is best, and then says the main drag in the thrill of the chase. So just some interesting stuff. I thought this is the last video I'm going to do on this. And so I hope you guys liked it. And again, subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed. It would mean a lot to me. So anyways, thank you to all my subscribers and the people that watch my videos and comment. You know, I love reading the comments, whether you agree or disagree. I just, I love discussing Forrest Fenn. So anyways, that's it for this video. I will catch you on the next one. My next one is probably, I'm going to start a book review series, probably on either one of Eric Salone's books, maybe 80, or A Journey of a Trapper. Or if you guys have a book that you want me to go through and read, then comment below and tell me what book you think I should go through next, and I can go that way. So thank you guys. I'll see you guys in the next video.